President Obama unveils a new strategy for Africa. But as the US deploys secret drones, covert special operations forces, and private military contractors across the continent, can it really lecture Africans about democracy and accountability? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The election of a US president with a Kenyan father was greeted by jubilant scenes in that country in 2008. And President Obama talked about a new moment of promise for Africa when he visited Ghana in 2009. Building on that theme, the White House has just launched a new strategy for Africa, promising to strengthen democracy and encourage economic growth through trade and investment. Though the strategy does mention the importance of countering al-Qaeda across the continent, there was no mention of the role of the US Africa Command, which was established in 2007 under George W. Bush. Under the Obama presidency, the US has expanded its military footprint and its secret intelligence operations across Africa, establishing a series of small bases to launch spy missions and drone strikes on groups like al-Shabaab in Somalia. US troops have also been deployed, particularly in Uganda, where they're searching for Joseph Kony, the leader of the Lord's Resistance Army. That's in addition to increasing numbers of private military contractors operating in Africa. All this as the US watches China steadily building up its strategic and commercial ties with a continent rich with resources. Here's President Obama setting out his vision for the role of the US in Africa before the Ghanaian Parliament in 2009.
We encourage the vision of a strong regional security architecture that can bring effective transnational forces to bear when needed. America has a responsibility to work with you as a partner to advance this vision, not just with words, but with support that strengthens African capacity. When there's a genocide in Darfur or terrorists in Somalia, these are not simply African problems, they are global security challenges, and they demand a global response. And that's why we stand ready to partner through diplomacy and technical assistance and logistical support, and we will stand behind efforts to hold war criminals accountable. And let me be clear, our Africa Command is focused not on establishing a foothold in the continent, but on confronting these common challenges to advance the security of America, Africa, and the world.
So, what is motivating US policy towards Africa? I'm joined in the studio by David Shin, a former US ambassador to Ethiopia and Burkina Faso. From New York, we're joined by Paul Mutter, a fellow at truthout.org. And in the studio, Nia Quetta, an African policy analyst who was formerly executive director of Africa Action. Nia Quetta, looking at President Obama's vision for Africa, I mean, was there a bold departure from previous administrations, or was it simply a continuation, perhaps an enhancement of what we were seeing under the Bush administration?
I think in terms of rhetoric, it was a bold departure, because even though President Bush in his second inaugural talked about democracy promotion, he was thinking more of the Middle East. On Africa, he never really talked about democracy. President Bush didn't. So it was exciting that President Obama went to Accra and talk about how African countries needed not strong men, but strong institutions, democracy. On the other hand, as the story in the Washington Post showed, the practice was very different. AFRICOM has been the spear tip of U.S. policy in Africa, increasing militarization, and it's, in my view, it's a mistaken and failed policy.
Right, so this Washington Post story came out last week. It revealed the secret intelligence network, a dozen small air bases since 2007, turboprop planes and so forth. A lot of detail actually about how they're concealed and so forth. I mean, Paul Mutter, actually, I mean, do we know, was that a scoop from the Washington Post? Were we meant to know about this? I mean, that's one of those questions that we ask a lot these days in Washington, but what do we know about this?
Yes, it is. What we do know is that the administration really has expanded logistically the program that George Bush started with AFRICOM. I remember that was only a few years ago that started, and now what we're seeing is kind of the magic bullet approach to this administration's counterterrorism policy, where it believes it can go in light and quick, special operations, surveillance, strikes, all sorts of that, collaboration with militaries in the region, and that it can, in a sense, take a preventative approach is I think what they're looking at. Not in Somalia, for example, since that problem is still ongoing. But in other cases, it's definitely the United States is looking to head off some problems, what it seems to be threats to the homeland, ahead of time. And as it's doing this, the question comes in, and Nia, I think Mali is a good example of this. You wrote about this, about how AFRICOM's 3 points are to diplomacy, development, and defense. And we saw in Mali how there was the defense emphasis, and as a result, the diplomacy and the development kind of fell by the wayside. And in the end, the defense also fell by the wayside, because as a result of the Tuareg clashes and the coups and the military losses, the country now has a northern separatist state with Islamist groups operating in it. So the question is, are we making the problems worse? Are we putting ourselves in fights that we don't even have, not that we don't have an interest in, but that we're exposing ourselves to threats that may not exist, and we might actually be exacerbating them and directing them towards us.
I was going to bring up Mali a little later on, but since you have now brought it up, Ambassador, I'll come to you in a moment in that case. But what is your understanding of what happened in Mali? Because you did recently write about this, and how indicative is this of President Obama's policy in Africa right now?
I think that, as I referenced in my first answer, I think in a way AFRICOM has hijacked the rest of President Obama's Africa policy.
What happened in Mali? How is Mali indicative of that?
I think the way Mali is indicative is that they went in with both feet, and they encouraged the Malians, they militarized, they gave Mali a lot of military assistance to go after Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Instead of dealing with internal issues, the problem with the Tuaregs, development, other issues, and therefore that caused a big problem. And the concern with the Washington Post story is that if they are doing Burkina Faso what they did in Mali, then I worry for Burkina Faso and I worry for the rest of the region.
All right, Ambassador, I mean, the point about Mali, I suppose, is it seemed like it was on a promising trajectory democratically. And then, in the end, the democratic government is overthrown by a bunch of army personnel who've been trained by the Americans. And so, of course, alarm bells start ringing, and we start wondering what's going on. What's your analysis of that, then?
Well, clearly, Mali is a big disappointment. It was a very promising case of democracy working. I think Mali has a couple of dynamics going on. One is the Tuareg rebellion, which is very ancient and very deep-seated in Mali, and that was probably the touchstone for the reason for the military taking over. But now you've had the problem exacerbated with various Salafi elements taking advantage of a very disturbed situation in northern Mali. And it's a little difficult at the moment to sort out what role the Tuaregs are playing and what role the Salafists are playing.
But the suggestion we seem to be getting from Nii and others is President Obama's policy in some ways contributed to this rather messy situation that we have in Mali. If only they'd actually concentrated on development, perhaps, and democracy, instead of the war on terror and seeing everything through the prism of the war on terror, perhaps we might not be in the situation.
I think that the Obama administration was at the same...
Paul, we'll get to you in a second.
...was at the same time trying to encourage democratization in Mali. I think that's been a plank of its program there. It is true they were training the Malian forces to deal with terrorism in the Trans-Sahara Initiative.
You then use that training to overthrow the democratically elected government and prevent...
Well, if those were the same individuals who did it, then yes, in that sense it backfired. But that certainly wasn't the intention. But I think there was an element of encouraging democracy at the same time. It's one of these cases that hasn't worked out well.
Nia Quetta, is there any suggestion of anything we don't know? And was there any suggestion that the democracy in Mali wasn't going the way that perhaps U.S. strategic interests would have liked, or anything like that?
Oh, I think there's a great deal we don't know, because, you know, the Tuaregs, as the ambassador said, the feud with Bamako had been ancient. They've been tried. Several insurgencies didn't succeed. It succeeded this time because of weapons and men flowing in from Libya. The question is, if there is all this surveillance of terrorists and arms moving, how is it that they did not see what was coming into Mali, and how is it that the Amadou Touré government got so little help once the Tuaregs started fighting? So I think there is a lot that we don't know, and it's good for both the U.S. and for Africa to find out what actually went on in Mali. And one more thing, I think the problem with the Mali strategy was that even though there was talk of democracy, in actual implementation and funds, they privilege the military part. So they paid lip service to democracy, but all of the training and the money went into military issues. That was the problem. The military arm of the aid is way too much. I've had African officials tell me, you know, when AFRICOM comes to see us, they arrive in their own jets. When the State Department people come to see us, they arrive on Air Afrique. So the Africans understand that it is the military.
Although the State Department itself is now involved with the military training of various forces as well. It's all getting merged in some ways, isn't it?
Right, but State Department officials, and I'm sure the ambassador would have heard of this, they complain that they are overwhelmed by these special forces and military emphasis. So the State Department, with my reading, is not entirely happy about the military emphasis, the militarization of U.S. policy in Africa. The democracy, they pay lip service, they don't do it as well.
Paul, you wanted to get in.
Right. Well, you made my point actually about Libya in that we have a lot of these people came back over from Libya with weapons from the Libyan military, and what we're looking at is we're supposed to have a policy that's a Pan-African focus. We're supposed to be dealing with threats, AQIM. There is supposed to be a Pan-African across the Sahel.
Yeah.
Right. We're supposed to have a Pan-African emphasis and Pan-African threats, and as Nia kind of implied, was someone asleep at the wheel with Mali, where all this stuff moved in, and then the coup happened, and what exactly was the situation there? Were we... to me, it looks like we were a bit taken aback by the way things transpired.
Ambassador, and clearly it's interesting.
Spillover.
It's particularly interesting because Libya was seen in some ways, or fated, certainly in Washington, as a great success for AFRICOM. In some ways, at least, you know, AFRICOM was in charge with the initial phases of the military campaign, and everyone said, "Oh, look, they did so well." And yet, in that interconnected manner, it meant huge instability then in neighboring Mali as a knock-on effect. I mean, was someone asleep at the wheel? Were there other strategic interests at play here which we don't necessarily know about?
I think that there was always concern that there would be fallout from the situation in Libya because Gaddafi was employing a significant number of Africans in the military. And once his military was defeated, they were going to go somewhere. And a lot of them went south into Mali and Niger, and I don't think anyone was surprised by that. I think they were very disappointed, but not surprised.
So they just sit back and go, "Oh, well, that didn't work."
Well,
that's how they work.
Yeah. Again, as you indicate, there's a lot we don't know about what they tried to do or didn't try to do, and it's possible that they didn't do enough and should have done more, but we just don't know the answer.
All right, well, so that's a really interesting example then to launch the discussion about what the U.S. is trying to achieve in Africa. We can take a look actually across Africa at the number of U.S. bases across the continent as far as we know. From Camp Lemonnier in Djibouti, the U.S. military targets al-Shabaab in Somalia and al-Qaeda in Yemen. From Ethiopia, the U.S. flies Reaper drones over Somalia targeting al-Shabaab. It also uses an island base in the Seychelles to fly Reaper drones over East Africa. And from Uganda, the U.S. flies PC-12 surveillance aircraft to keep watch on areas used by the warlord Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army. These are all the stated objectives. Anyway, the U.S. is also planning to base surveillance planes in South Sudan. And in West Africa, the Washington Post has revealed a classified surveillance program named Creek Sand being run out of Ouagadougou, which Nii just mentioned, I think, in Burkina Faso, from which the U.S. flies PC-12 aircraft north to Mali, Mauritania, the Sahara, to search for al-Qaeda fighters. So again, much of that official narrative then this is based around the search for Islamic militants. However, when AFRICOM was conceived by the Heritage Foundation, I guess, you know, here in Washington, the right-wing think tank, and as it has been administered, everyone's been really quite open that actually there are three main planks for AFRICOM. Terrorism is one, as it's seen. Oil is the other, and China is the third then. I mean, how do all these priorities then intersect?
I think in practice what we are seeing is the flawed thinking behind AFRICOM. Because, in fact, the General Carter Ham, a couple of months ago on the Hill, the African commander, said that the size of the continent demands a certain intense presence. The argument is, if the #1 goal is to fight terrorism, and I, for one, think that there are terrorists who have attacked African countries, from Boko Haram to Somalia and other places. So it's not like Africans are not interested in the fight against terrorism. But I think AFRICOM's approach is misguided, because you have to deal with local grievances. You cannot have enough aircraft and enough soldiers to look for Islamists all over and kill them. So AFRICOM's emphasis on militarization is the problem.
But arguably the US doesn't really necessarily have the cash to spend on development and democracy, especially now. So might it not be wiser, as far as your strategic interests are concerned, to stick to military training and arms sales funding, which seems to be what we're seeing right now, in this kind of battle for resources, this battle against China for resources in Africa, and the battle against Islamic militancy and so forth?
I think U.S. has a comparative advantage in democracy. I mean, China is not anybody's idea of a democracy. The U.S. is a democracy. So I happen to think that, yes, it would take some resources, but in fact, you can promote democracy. For instance, one of the biggest positive pro-democracy things the U.S. can do is to stop backing dictators. The U.S. has backed dictators all over Africa for over 50 years. If it stopped, he doesn't have to spend money doing that, and you promote democracy that way.
No, but Ambassador, I mean, is it too cynical then to argue that perhaps in the short term, especially with China and various other, it's a lot of different countries from the Gulf to Brazil to everywhere, you know, eyeing Africa right now, actually democracy might not be in the best interest in the short term, because they may not favor American strategic interests over other strategic interests there.
I think that the Obama administration would make the argument that democracy is in its interest, and it does. It certainly says that it is very interested in continuing to support democracy. I would like to take exception, I think, to your prioritization of why AFRICOM came about. I would agree that counterterrorism is the top of the list. In fact, it's counterterrorism, and then nothing, and then maybe oil, and then a big drop down to China.
I suppose the Heritage Foundation chaps are a bit more candid, I suppose, in their assessment. But if this is
what AFRICOM does really has nothing to do with what China's doing in Africa. And there's not as much competition as you would suggest by trying to link the existence of AFRICOM to what China is doing in the continent. There's economic competition to some extent, but not a lot, quite frankly. Oil's a fungible resource. We buy more oil from Africa than China does. So I would really put China in a totally different category, but the terrorism angle is the important element here. I think there have been some nuanced changes in how the Obama administration has handled it as compared to the Bush administration, but it still is the top priority.
It is a good point. Paul Mutter, I mean, there might be some hope that having a strategic military footprint in Africa will help versus China, but there doesn't seem to be much evidence that necessarily does work. In fact, it almost seems like there's a division of labor. The U.S. supplies various dodgy governments sometimes with military arms and training. Meanwhile, the Chinese supply various governments with infrastructure and money. Meanwhile, the African people don't necessarily get much in the middle. But I mean, does the U.S.'s AFRICOM strategy necessarily have any bearing on their wish to exploit the resources of Africa? It doesn't seem to be working necessarily, does it?
I think that thinking is there. It was definitely part of all of the push within Congress and the Beltway establishment for AFRICOM. But again, in practice, it really is turning its counterterrorism, and then the footnotes. What we're looking at, actually, a colleague of mine named Steve Horn has documented how in the years before AFRICOM, it's actually been a lot of private military companies that are taking up the security contracts available to Western multinationals in the Great Lakes region, where they've found a lot of oil. So if that's somewhere where the U.S. is trying to get its foot in, official Washington is not really doing a very good job of that. It's all these private contractors. And just to touch on the point of democracy, I think Uganda would be a good place to talk about this, in the sense that what we've seen there is we have this very publicized campaign to go after Kony, head of the Lord's Resistance Army, the organization that's been ravaging northern Uganda and now some of the countries on the periphery for some time. And we had, it was announced, I believe last October, that we were dispatching the 100-man mission. And a few years before, we'd actually dispatched some advisors to help the regional militaries carry out a sweep that, according to Interpress Service, did not go very well. It failed to catch them, and then the LRA launched a counterattack, and a lot of people were killed in the process. So when we look at Uganda, we're seeing that the LRA may not even be in Uganda anymore. And the threat isn't, I mean, the threat is still present, but from what I'd seen in the response to the social media campaign, the one by the Enough Project, I believe it was, with Stop Coney.
With others.
I'm sorry,
yes.
Invisible Children, not Enough. And how a lot of the back blasts from that coming from Ugandans were that the LRA is no longer in the north. Our main problems are the government not really paying attention to the region. And so we have
specifically democracy in Uganda, I suppose. And of course, you know, even that the official base in Djibouti, Camp Lemonnier, I mean, some compare it perhaps to the U.S.'s relationship with Bahrain. I mean, Djibouti perhaps has carte blanche because it's such a strategic area to do whatever it wants, perhaps, to those forces of democracy there. I mean, isn't that the point, Ambassador, that when the Obama administration is continuing to see everything through the prism of the war on terror, governments in the region, the less scrupulous ones, say, all right, well, we'll fight your wars for you, or Islamic militants, give us the money, give us the training, give us the arms, but then they basically turn the firepower against opponents and shore up their governance versus democracy. Ambassador.
I think when push comes to shove, you're probably right. That is the overriding consideration. In all fairness, the Obama administration did have one major new initiative, Feed the Future, where it is trying to encourage agricultural development globally, but particularly in Africa. The problem is that they made this initiative at a time when U.S. resources are...
But that was very interesting, too, because many saw that, and that was, of course, mentioned again at the G8 summit recently. But when you looked at the small print, it was very much based in the old small print of the Washington Consensus, basically let industrial agribusiness in, basically, arguably at the expense of farmers. This was actually very good for Monsanto and for patented seeds and chemical fertilizer industrial concerns, but it wasn't going to do very much for food sovereignty. Again, when you've got China, perhaps, who's more willing to invest in local agriculture, again, for their own strategic interests. Again, is the U.S. losing out there as well by sticking to an old playbook of leaving it to Monsanto, basically, leaving development in Africa to Monsanto?
I don't know what the figures are on U.S. government money going into Feed the Future effort. As I was saying, the timing is unfortunate because the budgets just don't allow.
But it was based perhaps on a developmental model that's been widely discredited in the developing world. I mean, that was part of the problem.
Well, I'm not sure I would totally agree that it's been discredited. I know the China model quite well, and basically they're using, except for their small aid projects in the agricultural field, they're using their own state-owned companies to go in.
All right, so I mean, in conclusion then, I mean, as we look at this, what is primarily then a military strategy with, as the ambassador says, I mean, perhaps this idea of military strategy is uppermost in the mind. What is the relationship between AFRICOM, the AU, the various military arms that the U.S. funds and trains, like the East African Standby Force, for example, which are wholly dependent on the U.S., perhaps? That's part of the African Union. And then the kind of various militaries in Africa. I mean, how do all these meld together for some coherent strategy? And how does that work?
You know, it causes me sleepless nights, because I think what you are saying, I mean, there are African elites in government. They want to maintain power, so they will use any advantages, whether it's when it's brought by AFRICOM, then there is African brass. There's even the African business who like deals with China. The African people are left in the middle. Now, if you look at the White House statement, the new policy, it does emphasize again what President Obama said in Accra. In other words, it's not that they don't remember democracy, but they just pay lip service to it. And I actually think that is the U.S.'s comparative advantage. As you mentioned, the African people are left in the middle. If you push for democracy, the African people will appreciate it, because as I can tell you at the grassroots, a lot of Africans are uncomfortable.
What does that mean to push for democracy? How will that not be seen with suspicion as well if the U.S., given its record in the region?
As I mentioned, all you have to do is withdraw the strong support you give to Kagame, withdraw the strong support you give to Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, who was here.
Rwanda and Ethiopia, yeah.
Yes, and Uganda. wonder, because this is a long pattern of supporting dictators and closing your eyes so long as they are helping you with the Cold War or with fighting terrorists. If you withdraw the support and push, because Africans themselves, from the AU to ECOWAS, are saying you can come to power only through good elections and other things. So this AFRICOM-led militarization, to me, is undermining democracy, and I think it's also weakening U.S.'s own long-term interests. Any gains made with militarization is very short term.
Nia Quetta, thank you very much. Ambassador David Shinn, thank you.
Thank you.
Paul Nutter, thank you very much too. That's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find more information about the program. And we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. Send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net.